This episode of Where Did the Road Go is brought to you in part by our Patreons. If you want to become a patron, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Tonight I am speaking once again with Laird Scranton. How you doing, Laird?
I'm doing pretty good, Seriah. How are you doing?
All right. Your latest book is Decoding Maori Cosmology, the Ancient Origins of New Zealand's Indigenous Culture. And what book is this number-wise?
This is the 9th book, actually, in this series so far.
Yeah, I knew it was up there.
Yeah, it's getting there.
And this was written before the last one that came out that you self-published, is that right?
Yes, my difficulty was that the way publishers work, they sort of a rule of thumb in publishing is that you don't publish two books from the same author at the same time.
Right.
So I had submitted the Maori book, and it was in process, due to be out around May of 2018. But I had meanwhile finished a second book that was material that I really wanted to be able to talk about right this minute. And it was, if I waited to submit it until the other book was out, it would be another year and a half before it could be finished. So we might be looking at 2020 by the time they got it out. Mm. And this was material that every interview I was doing was leading up to this material. I couldn't, it's not really fair to talk about it without having a book that somebody can then pursue. I don't really want to talk about it now and undercut the publisher's book 2 years from now. And so I was between a rock and a hard place. I tried to get the publisher to agree to prioritize it, and they couldn't do that. So I took the option of self-publishing it.
Okay. Now, you talk about, you had the idea for this book early on.
Yeah, the Maori book, I could see very early in my process. I had some early ethnological studies of the Maori tribe in New Zealand, and realized their concept of the po, which is the Dogon's concept of an atom, is an overlapping concept. They both see things the same way. There are multiple meanings to the word po they both have, and there are aspects of this as a component of matter and as a reference to primordial time and a number of other things that the two cultures had in common. So I knew this is a signature for me. Tells me there's going to be a connection here. So I had intended to write about the Maori as my second book. I had actually started work on the project. But over the years, it kept getting bumped by more urgent material. And so I would set it aside and come back to it after each book and think I was going to work on it next, and then it would get bumped again. So now I'm very, very pleased that it took that long to get around to it, because I realize I have the perspective now to understand that it connects to every era and region that I've written about. The Maori are a much later tradition. Most of my books are focused on around 3000 BC, and the Maori are more like 1280.
Right. Well, let's go back. Why don't you give people the basic idea, sort of the story so far, for people who might be new to your work?
Okay, that's good, because that will make it easier to understand the references in the new book. It's a little bit of a complicated outlook. This is a tradition that begins at 10,000 BC, around 10,000 BC, in the Fertile Crescent region at a site called Gobekli Tepe. And there are three paths of transmission from that era forward that I'm tracing. One is what looks like direct influences on ancient Egypt at 10,000 BC. If we imagine that the Sphinx points to Leo in the era of 10,000 BC, and that the three pyramids at Giza point to the belt stars of Orion at 10,000 BC, then someone had to at least have made those alignments in that era. If they didn't, if they waited until later to make the alignments, then we have to presume that somebody had the capability of retrospectively calculating those, which I don't think they had. So We have direct influences on Egypt at 10,000 BC. We have another set of influences that travel down through India and into Egypt at Elephantine around 4,000 BC. And then we have a third set of influences that leave the Fertile Crescent sometime after 6,000 BC and jump to northern Scotland. We have half a dozen different influences in northern Scotland that tie positively to the Fertile Crescent at 6,000 BC. We have DNA-tested barley. We have a DNA-tested sheep. We have a type of mouse or a vole. We have a burial tradition. We have a number of other things on Orkney that all keep pointing back to this era of 6,000 BC in the Fertile Crescent region. Those influences on Orkney happen around 3,200 BC and are immediately followed by the establishment of agriculturally based kingships in 4 different regions of the planet by around 3,000 BC or 3,100 BC. One was in Egypt called Taru. Another was in China called Iru. There was a third one in Ireland called Aru, and a fourth one down in South America called Peru. So it looks like we have these 3 lines of transmission, all end up back at Egypt at some point. The last one, coming from Orkney, arrives just at the time of dynastic Egypt. Now, around 2600 BC, the Orkney site is suddenly abandoned, and whoever was there moves outward and southward. Some of them move to Scotland and England and Ireland. Some of them move in other directions, but we can trace the ones that moved into the UK. You get into Ireland and you have an awful lot of commonalities with New Zealand. And there are myths in Ireland that say that the group that connects to this tradition were forced out and left. One tradition says they left by boat across the Western Sea. The other tradition in Ireland says that they went to the underworld. In New Zealand, we have a mirror image myth that says that a group arrived in New Zealand, a pre-Maori group arrived in New Zealand that came by boat from across the Eastern Sea. And an ancient name for New Zealand, according to one of the documenter of the dictionary, the comparative dictionary that I use there, it means first circle of the underworld. So the New Zealand myth mirrors both Irish myths and encompasses the perspective of both myths.
Okay.
So those are the traditions that we're sort of trying to track. Maori cosmology also reflects influences of Palestine. The tradition that came out of Fertile Crescent around 6,000 BC seems to have moved south into Palestine before it jumps to Orkney. We have some comparability on Orkney to that same region. So Maori cosmology really ties to each of these eras in interesting ways, sometimes always through language. Language is one of the keys we can track things by. The Dogon tribe also provides us comparability with language. Their language is technically not classifiable because it consists of upwards of 17 different subgroupings of language that the Dogon are very sort of strict about keeping distinct. And so you can almost trace the regions of influence on Dogon culture from these segments of their languages. You go to Maori culture, and the Maori words are based on, very often based on the Dogon phonetics. The Dogon try to preserve original forms, and their forms go way back. It's an oral tradition with the Dogon, and everything is expressed in terms of syllables. Those syllables have meaning in the Maori language. So by the time I got around to writing this book, I could sit down simply with a Maori dictionary, a comparative Maori Polynesian dictionary. I could quite often predict the meaning of a word, a Maori word that I had never seen before, based on its phonetics. The Dogon phonetics are like, these syllables are like little building blocks that you can mix and match and put together. Each syllable represents kind of a root concept, and those root concepts also go together. So when you speak a Dogon word, if you know what the the syllables represent, you can also predict what the word's going to mean.
Okay. All right.
So language is a huge piece of that.
Right. What previous books on the Maori do you draw from to build this?
Well, we're all in the work that I'm doing, which is comparative cosmology. I'm trying to learn more about the meanings of symbols and myths and rituals and so forth by comparing the same element, how it was understood in different cultures. So these elements are the purpose of comparing these elements is to positively tie an understanding of what the original meaning of these symbols and rituals or whatever were, to be able to argue that three different cultures saw this the same way. It's pretty likely that the original meaning of this term or the original meaning of this practice was blah blah. Maori culture is allowing me to affirm that, and language is allowing me to do it. Their practices are allowing me to do it. Not sure if I answered your question.
Well, you cite a few different books that were written about the Maori.
Oh yeah, so I'm looking at original forms, and so in Maori culture, I start with the earliest ethnological studies of the Maori culture. The earliest one is by a writer named Elston Best, who spent a couple of decades in close proximity with the Maori, and he states in his book, in the leading pages of his book, that look, this is the first treatise he knew of that dealt with these, from the Maori point of view, these inner concepts of their cosmology. And so part of what I did was I could compare that to Dogon anthropological studies conducted by French anthropologists back in the 1930s through 1950s, and find comparability between the practices and how they were understood in each culture. We have other ways of comparing these things too. There are half a dozen different ways of verifying or affirming the accuracy of a certain reference. In Dogon culture, the Dogon words that are used to describe the cosmological terms are very often ancient Egyptian words. So I can compare a Dogon word to a set of Egyptian words and demonstrate that the meanings haven't changed. It's substantially the same meaning and pronunciation in both places. So I can verify language that way. The cosmological symbols and some of the rituals and so forth tie to Buddhism positively. You have a grand symbol for Buddhism that's a shrine called a stupa. You have a very closely matching shrine for the Dogon that's also the grand symbol of their cosmology. And the two symbolic cosmologies, the cosmology means, it refers to how it's understood that processes of creation happen. They're talking about how matter forms, how the universe forms, and how biological reproduction happens. So the concepts I can compare from the Dogon to Buddhism. Even though they're given in completely different languages, the symbolism is all the same. So I have cross-comparability there. The Maori gives me yet another view into that. Each book that I've written gives me another view. I can see it from a Chinese perspective. I can see it from perspectives in Tibet. I can see it from perspectives in Turkey. I can see it from the UK perspective and so forth. The Maori book gives us another whole other point of view on this and a much later point of view. So as you can imagine, certain references change over time. There's a factor of reversing symbolism that happens. It's a confusing idea that midway through this tradition from 10,000 BC to now, suddenly certain symbolic elements flip their symbolism. The one that people are probably most familiar with is matriarchy and patriarchy. Mm-hmm. That what started out as a feminine tradition in archaic times, by around 2600 BC has started to become a patriarchal tradition in various cultures that don't have contact with each other. It was very confusing to me at first. How could two cultures that are not understood or have had any contact whatsoever with each other be changing their symbols in the same ways at the same moment?
And why the flip?
And why would they do that? the metaphor I give to make it understandable is if you imagine taking a cross-continental flight on a plane with a bunch of people you don't know. Chances are you might speak to one or two of them while you're on the plane. But by the time you get to your destination, everybody has changed their watches by 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
It's not because anybody communicated among themselves they had to do it. They all know how time zones work. And so each one of them independently about the same moment changes. You know, some of them might change it early in the flight. Some of them might wait until they get to their destination to change it. That's the way these symbolic reversals work with these cultures. You see them all at approximately the same era making these same reversals. That initially a circle is representing the concept of the earth, and by the time you get to ancient Egypt, it's a square that represents the concept of the earth.
Okay. But we don't know why they decided to make those changes.
Well, actually we do, but it doesn't
Okay.
tie to the Maori book. It ties to the book I self-published called Seeking the Primordial.
Okay.
And the problem, it's a complicated rationale. It's actually a book-length rationale, but what it boils down to is that, like Buddhist concepts of a Yuga cycle, that over time we have a shift in an energetic shift that happens between the non-material and the material realm. And because of that shift, when things have shifted more than halfway, suddenly certain elements, certain aspects of what's going on reverse themselves. It's like an hourglass. You start out with all the sand at the top of the hourglass. Halfway through, you have equal amounts of sand in both halves. And by the time you get to the end, all the sand's in the bottom half. That's what's happening with these energetic shifts. And the symbolism that represented the less full half to begin with now suddenly has to represent the more full half.
Okay. Now, who are the Maori?
Okay. The Maori are Polynesians. No one is absolutely sure where they came from. From their perspective, in their tribal memory, they came from a place called Hawaii. They came by canoe to New Zealand. It is estimated by around 1200 AD. Europeans first stumbled on New Zealand around 1500 AD. So there are only a few hundred years between the traditional perspectives on when the Maori arrived, or the Maori, and the time when Europeans were there. By the time the Europeans got there, what they describe is a culture, a native culture there that has quite a few civilizing aspects to it. It's not an uncivilized way of life that they see there from a European perspective. But again, from the European perspective, they see their own approach to life as being more civilized.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are also hugely controversial perspectives in New Zealand on the possibility of short-statured people having lived in New Zealand prior to the Maori. By the traditional historical standards, the Maori are the first people who were there, that's it. But little hints turn up again and again about other groups that were there that tie to short-statured traditions in Ireland. These are what produced the concepts of little people in the UK, or of the fairies in the UK. And you actually have fairy mound structures in New Zealand that are mirror images of what you have in the UK, with the same low entryways that an average-sized person today would have to crawl into rather than walk standing up into. One of the perspectives is, they built their doorways low so that animals couldn't get in. But if you think about it, that doesn't really make sense, because most of the animals are short enough they can crawl in anyway. The more telling thing for me is that in certain of these structures, especially in the UK, even the inside room doors are low doorways. Now, what person my size would put a doorway they had to crawl through between their bedroom and their living room?
Right. You wouldn't.
You wouldn't. So we have that kind of comparability between Ireland and New Zealand. We also have, in Ireland, the single most common archaeological form they find around the country are horseshoe shaped structures called phylactefiad. They have no idea what these structures were used for, but they find them everywhere, and they can't understand why do we see so many of these. When you go to New Zealand, to Maori culture, and you discover that their village schools were built to that same shape. The Maori tell us what skills were being taught in their schools. These are basically schools for experts in cosmology and experts in agriculture. But there were other skills that were also being taught. They were teaching astronomy. They were teaching all the things you see appearing in the Fertile Crescent region at 10,000 BC. You see being taught in the Maori schools. And these are also the same set of skills that we can see evidence of on Orkney Island at 3200 BC.
Okay. Go on. Okay. I don't know if I interrupted you there or not.
No, go ahead. That's fine.
You talk about three central themes that all these cultures have in common.
Right. Now, from the Dogon perspective, these three themes are considered to be parallel. The processes of creation, how the universe forms, how matter forms, and how biological reproduction happens, that those processes are so fundamentally similar to each other that the Dogon system describes them simultaneously using a single progression of symbols. From my point of view, there's a little bit of a hint of somebody showing off here. This is a demonstration of capability. Here, with one series of drawings, I can explain to you how all three of these complicated processes happen. So when we talk about the meaning of a symbol, you can't really ask, what is the meaning of a hemisphere? You have to say, what does a hemisphere represent if we're talking about biological reproduction? Well, there it represents the expanded womb of a woman.
Right.
If we're talking about the formation of matter, it represents the expansion of mass. These are parallel concepts, but with the point of view shifted just a little bit to the theme that we're talking about.
Okay. Now with the Maori, we're not they don't worship anything.
No, in this tradition, where we say worship, where later traditions say worship, they say celebrate or praise. So there isn't an aspect of worship, but because the mindset of the cosmology, if you go back far enough, this is fundamentally a scientific tradition, where the Dogon are describing scientifically reasonable stages for how matter forms. The comparable Egyptian words are referring to deities who supposedly perform the same actions, relate to the same stage of creation. So you have an anthropomorphizing of concepts that goes on. It happens sort of in stages. At Gobekli Tepe, you have icons, basically. You have a few symbols, and you have animals representing as icons representing certain concepts. When you get further down into the traditions in India, the animal itself becomes the icon of whatever the concept is, but then pretty soon it shifts so that the icon is now the avatar of an anthropomorphized deity who represents the concept. But you can always tell, even though you have 1,000 different permutations of a mother goddess, the animal that's associated with any given one of those identifies for you who they're really talking about. If you see, a mouse associated with a deity in India, chances are really, really good they're talking about Ganesha.
Okay, and with the Maori, it was Io. Is that right?
Yes, they're sort of the supreme deity of the Maori tradition is the name is spelled I-O. I compare it to because of the references the Maori give, which are some of them are almost literally passages from Genesis. This is Yah, I would say. This is Io or Yah. It's to me there's parallelism between those two.
Okay. So one of the things you write in here, one of the creation myths of the Maori is Tangora or Tangaroa. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay.
Tangaroa.
Yeah,
And
it takes
understanding that we're mostly mutilating pronunciations as they should be in New Zealand.
right, right. But they take refuge in the ocean, and their lizard-like children live on land. Sounds like something out of a Lovecraft story.
Yes, it absolutely does. The Maori are much more into, okay, as this progression for anthropomorphizing deities continues, by the time you get down to ancient Greece, there are elaborate stories about what these humanoid deities or human deities, deities in human image, are doing. These become soap operas over time.
Hmm, really?
And those stories start out as alternate ways of trying to symbolically represent. They're trying to use a metaphor to represent a concept. Imagine that there was a very important idea you needed to communicate to somebody, 10,000 years from now, and you had no idea what references that were going to resonate with them.
Right.
You wanted to create a metaphor that would communicate this scientific idea through non-technical people to a technical audience 10,000 years later. Well, whoever put this cosmology together seemed to have hedged their bets. They couch everything in multiple metaphors, not knowing for sure which one is going to work, which one's going to resonate. They say it 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 different ways, hoping that one of them is going to hit.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about this, but let's get into the major connections with the Dogon teachings. Like, what are the main points you find there?
Organization of the society, to begin with, is very similar. That the role of the experts, the tohungas in Maori culture, is almost identical to the role of the hogan in Dogon culture. In the archaic tradition, these were yoginis. These were women who passed down an oral tradition, an oral cosmology. These were women who were focused on fertility and yoga. Yoga is a companion piece to the cosmological philosophy of Samkhya that all this stuff, for me, is based on. So the structure, how that's structured, the villages, the relationship of the priests or the experts to the villages, all of that plays out very, very similar with the Dogon. I've talked about the phonetics of the language being consistent between the two languages, even though the Maori words are formulated differently and tend to be more complex words than the Dogon words. It's still mixing and matching the same phonetics, so you can see connections there. There is comparability in the structuring. By the time we get to Maori culture, we're talking about what's mythical deities. These are deities that storylines are being written about. In Dogon culture, there's really only one mythical character in Dogon culture who rises to the level of what we would call a deity. It's the creator god Amma. But Amma initiates the acts of creation. And when we look at the phonetics of Amma's name, Am means to know, which in the biblical sense is biological fertilizing. It's fertilizing an egg. Ma is the act of perception, which is the act that initiates the processes of material matter creation.
Okay.
So Ma name is formulated in terms of creative acts. You can see this is a scientific concept originally. This isn't the character. And it's only because in order to explain processes and to illustrate what processes are, they allow mythical characters to act them out in these storylines. This is a mnemonic device to help keep things straight.
Yeah.
What's really interesting is there's in the original forms of these stories, there's self-confirmation of meaning happening. That's one of the ways we know we've hit on something that's original. Is anything that that was in the root tradition, they tag it by repeating the same value or the same concept in more than one way. My friend Ed Nightingale has done reverse engineering of the Giza Plateau, and what he finds there is definitions of units of measure of various types, like cubits. But you'll see the same value repeated in meters or in cubits or in in inches, that cross confirm both the number they're trying to communicate and reaffirm the idea of these units of measure, these different units of measure. In the Dogon shrine that they build, the shrine culminates in a square flat top that's 8 cubits by 8 cubits. That it would be 64 square cubits. The base culminates in a base that has a diameter of 10 cubits. If you use 3.2 as a rounded value of pi, you end up with 64 cubits as the circumference of the base. So you have cross-confirming numbers in that symbolic form that testify to it being an original form. You don't find that same cross-confirmation in every other shrine form.
Okay. The Maori word, is it now? I'm saying that wrong. Is it Maori or?
Well, without a New Zealand accent, I say Maori.
Maori. Okay.
With a New Zealand accent, they say Maori.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, they have a word for darkness, for the underworld, that's Po. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, the Dogon. This was one of my entry points into this whole study. Is I could see that I was researching why the Dogon knew some things about astronomy they shouldn't know. They knew of the existence of a second star on the Sirius star system. They knew the correct orbital period for the stars. But they also, the Dogon priests say, by the way, when our symbols describe how matter forms. And then they talk about the Po. And the Po, as they describe it, is, they say, all things are formed by the continuous repetition of an initial unit called the Po. This is a definition of an atom. Mm-hmm. And then they talk about what they call sene seeds, which combine at the center of the Po and then cross in all directions to surround the Po and create a nest. They've now correctly described protons and neutrons and electrons. So with what limited perspective I had on how matter formed when I started this process, I could see, hey, they got the definition of an atom right. They have the definition of electrons and protons right. What are the chances that this whole descending structure that they described could also be right, scientifically right? And so I started reading Brian Greene and Stephen Hawking and people like that to try to sort out how close is the representation. My first book is actually pretty much just a side-by-side comparison of what popular scientists say about a topic and what the diagrams they use to describe it, and then what the Dogon say about it and the drawing the Dogon used to define it. Mm-hmm. And in most cases, you could substitute the Dogon description for the scientific one and not change the meaning of, Stephen Hawking's chapter.
Yeah. So do you find the same thing with the Maori?
So the Maori are a later incarnation of this tradition. And so you have the same kind of trace of original meaning that's there, but not nearly in as coherent form as the earlier versions.
Okay.
But in similar form to what you see in, let's say, the Book of Genesis. You have passages that the Maori preserve that are almost word for word Book of Genesis, same concept. You have Io, who compares to Yah or Yahweh in the Hebrew tradition. Even on Orkney Island, in that era, we have references that tie. You have a bay that the first farming village was set on called the Bay of Skael. Well, Skael takes the form of, the name Skael takes the form of a naming convention in this tradition, that the tribal groups that preserve the tradition named themselves for a particular aspect of it. It's sort of like declaring your major in college. That the word Sakai or Sakai in Egyptian hieroglyphic language means to celebrate. So Skael says celebrates El. Now El was a god of space in Palestine that was a counterpart to Yah, who was the god of light. So you have comparability back to that same later Christian tradition or Hebrew tradition, even on Orkney. So that a lot of that carries forward in the Maori tradition. Each culture has been able to preserve different aspects of this, and part of my job is to see how they tie together, to point out the ways in which this piece links with that piece. It's as if you had, this is actually the same process that English scholars went through to produce standardized versions of the Shakespeare texts, the plays.
Really?
Back in Shakespeare's day, there weren't any copyright laws.
Mm-hmm.
And so every publisher wanted to be the first one on the street with an edition of Shakespeare's new play. So they'd send some staff member down to see the play and scribble down the spoken lines as they were said on stage. And so you ended up with, a dozen different versions of the same play where, with various lines, people got different ways. They misheard this word or they misheard that word. The scholars compare all of those different versions, knowing that they all came from a single source. They can do comparative, comparisons of the things that are different and infer which one must be the right quote.
Right.
So that's basically what I'm doing with, especially with myths. What I'm doing is trying to get down to the root concepts that were being expressed and then compare the variant versions of all these myths and identify the pieces that look like they're original.
Right. Okay. What about the Buddhist influences and evidence for Buddhist influence in the Maori? I'm not going to say it right.
Yeah, in New Zealand, a couple of the researchers there are express confusion because they can see ties to the Dravidian languages of the Tamil, which are a group that transmitted the tradition from Gobekli Tepe region down into India. The Tamil are still a living cultural group. The cult is called the Shakti cult, and it's still a living cult. It's a matriarchal cult in India. So in New Zealand, they can see evidence of the Tamil language, but they don't see any evidence of any of the Hindu gods. And so both Tregear and Elson Best say, we don't get this. How could they have one and not have the other? Their perspective was, if these were Hindu influences, we should have Hindu gods.
Right.
My perspective is that we had a jump from the region where the Tamil language was influential in the Fertile Crescent over to Orkney Island before we ever see Hinduism and Buddhism. And if we follow that path through Orkney down through Ireland and then off to New Zealand, now we have Tamil references, but we don't have Hindu references.
Okay. And of course, Gobekli Tepe kind of plays into this whole thing as the
does.
core of it.
Yeah, there's a really interesting. You probably have seen pictures of some of the symbols that are present at Gobekli Tepe.
Right.
There's self-confirmation of meaning with these symbols also. There's a symbol there that looks like the letter H. It's repeated a couple of times on pillars.
Yeah.
Well, that symbol survived in the Masonic tradition. And what it represents at 1918 in an article in a magazine called the New Age magazine, that was a Masonic magazine, a writer there explains that what this H symbol represents is primordial energies coming together to catalyze the processes of creation. Well, that's the same thing that the configuration of the dung beetle in Egypt represents. It's non-existence coming into existence. You see it repeated a number of different ways. That concept, the idea of a non-material and material coming together, is reflected in half a dozen different images at Gobekli Tepe. One of the metaphors is the concept of an embrace. It took me a long, long, long time to recognize that the sort of sterile carved, there are two pairs of arms that are carved on one of the pillars. They come out of the sides of the pillars, and then they trace down the sides in sort of a curve, and then produce hands that wrap around the end of the pillar and touch the ends of the fingers. Now, in your wildest of dreams, artistically speaking, you wouldn't guess that that sort of sterile rendering could represent the concept of a warm embrace. But all of the rest of the symbolism says that it does. And that concept of an embrace is another metaphor for these two universes coming together. So now, one of the set of symbols at Gobekli Tepe are three what look like handbag shapes. There's a rounded top and a squared bottom. This is an early expression of squaring a circle. And squaring a circle is a metaphor for the non-material meeting the material. A circle is representative of the non-material, and a square is representative of the material. In ancient China, the first two deities there, the mother goddess and the creator god, are holding, she holds calipers to measure out the circularity of the heavens, and he holds a carpenter's square to measure out the squareness of the earth. Reconciling a circle with a square implies non-material and material coming together. So these handbag shapes do the same thing. Three handbags in the same region, or nearby that same region in Iraq, an early temple form was called a chaitya, and it was characterized by three domes that were symbolic of a temple. A temple is a place where the non-material and the material come together. So for me, that's what those handbags represent. In Maori culture, there's a myth that's preserved about a departmental god called Tane, who ascends to the gods and returns with three baskets full of knowledge. The Dogon cosmology is often referred to as the basket cosmology because their shrine, that's like a Buddhist stupa, takes the shape of a wicker basket that's round at the top and square at the bottom that's been turned over on its top.
Right.
There's an early form of portable shrine in Egypt called the set that takes exactly that same, the handbag shape of the rounded top and the squared bottom. It was sort of a template for later shrine forms in ancient Egypt.
Okay.
So the Maori have all these little pieces that tie, some of them predictably to the Gobekli Tepe references, but also predictably to all of these other traditions.
And you think the core of all this starts at Gobekli Tepe?
That's the first evidence we have of it, but that may not be the start of it. The problem is that the Ice Age serves as a kind of block, an effective block to evidence. We don't have positive ways. I don't have positive ways yet to trace evidence past further back than the end of the Ice Age, which is just shortly before the Gobekli Tepe era.
Mm-hmm.
So Gobekli Tepe is where we see the first evidence of the tradition. It doesn't mean that the tradition actually started there. It also, in terms of a Yuga cycle, Gobekli Tepe sits early in the half cycle of the Yuga that we're just now finishing. We just now finished.
Yeah, that the Kali Yuga.
Right. We just now, by tradition, there are different calculations of how the Yuga goes. By the most common view, we passed the bottom of the cycle about 1,200 years ago.
Okay, I thought we were just at the tail end of it.
Well, the references I see keep consistently pointing to us having just passed the bottom point. The energies are just now reversing, so that what had previously been material is becoming not less material, and what had previously been non-material is becoming more material now. And there are weird effects associated with that, because when those concepts of time are wrapped up in those energies that are reversing, scientists like of the caliber of Stephen Hawking talk about what happens if the flow of time reverses itself.
Mm-hmm. And
that question hinges on a very complicated concept called chirality, which is really non-symmetry. If time going both directions is a mirror of itself, if it's symmetrical, then reversing time would be transparent to us. We shouldn't see any effects. If it's chiral, which means it's not symmetrical, then there are weird things that might happen. I have a friend who recently has begun experiencing weird deja vus. She says that they happen all the time. And she's learned that if she makes a different choice the second time, she can change the outcome.
Hmm. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Moving on from Gobekli Tepe. What are talk about Tamil? What is Tamil?
Okay, that the Tamil are a cultural group that originated to the north, are thought to have originated to the north and west of India. They're a major cultural group in India. I think they're the transmitters of this Shaktical tradition, which is the matriarchal tradition that preceded Hinduism and Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
They still have worship centers, primarily in centered in a place called Orissa on the east coast of the peninsula of India. There's a district in there that is primarily Tamil. So the Tamil have their own distinct languages. They're called the Dravidian languages. Again, there are huge controversies. I've been reading a book about Ganesha where the author, who I've actually been in contact with, his perspective is strongly against tracing Ganesha's tradition back to the Dravidians.
Why?
I'm not sure. He makes it, but his arguments are consistently opposed to that or poo-pooing that, minimizing it, saying, well, there's no compelling reason to think that this goes back to the Dravidian tradition. It didn't have to have originated there. He has a different region he believes it originates from. But from my perspective, based on how it was transmitted to other cultures, it almost has to pass through the Tamil.
Okay, and there's some similarities in the Tamil and Maori words.
There are. The Tamil language is written differently. The fortunate thing for me is cosmological words are associated with clusters of meanings, clusters of discrete meanings. So in Dogon country, Amma, the hidden god, the word Amma also can mean to grasp or to hold firm or to establish. When you go to ancient Egypt, Amen, who is the hidden god in Egypt, his name can also mean to hold firm or to establish. I read an article a few years back by a Hebrew scholar who was arguing that the Hebrew word Amen could not relate to the Egyptian word Amen. The Hebrew word Amen that falls at the end of a prayer couldn't connect to the Egyptian god Amen because the Hebrew word comes from a root that means to establish. Okay. And I thought, if he had a perspective on cosmology, he'd realize that he just shot himself in the foot because he's claiming that it connects to the root that's cosmological, that connects to Amen in Egypt.
Okay.
So these clusters of meanings let us positively correlate words between languages. They don't float. They look like they float with the phonetics, but they don't really. They really float with concepts. And so if you go to two very different languages, like the Dogon language is a spoken language only, and it correlates to ancient Egyptian words, very different from Sanskrit words. But the concepts correlate with these same clusters. So I can make an argument that the Dogon concept connects to the Buddhist concept, even though the languages are entirely different because the clusters of meanings are the same.
Right. Okay. What is the evidence? And you've sort of covered this a little bit, but what's the evidence that this data that this tradition is non-human, that is not coming from just people in the past?
Graham Hancock actually asked that. He posed that question one time on his website. He said, "Give me your best shot here for a non-human connection." I explained to him that I have two traditions here, the Dogon and the Buddhist tradition, that are each demonstrably ancient. The Buddhist tradition was documented by 400 BC. The Dogon tradition is given in words that went out of use largely by around 750 BC. But the Dogon culture their civic practices date from around 3000 BC. They compare to 3000 BC practices in Egypt. So these are both ancient traditions. They're given in entirely different languages. So it's not likely that one culture just adopted their system wholesale from the other. If they had, why didn't they take the words too? Why didn't the language come with the concepts? So it looks as if we have two traditions who kept the same really complicated symbolic system straight for thousands of years, since at least 400 BC to the present day. If you talk to a present day authority on Buddhism and a present day authority on Dogon culture, Dogon symbolism, they're in agreement with each other as to what these symbols mean. That means both groups. So now the Buddhists say that their most sacred symbols were gifted to humanity by a non-human source. This is stated like in the first 3 pages of my go-to guy's book, The Symbolism of the Stupa, a researcher named Adrian Snodgrass from University of West Sydney, Australia. He's a recognized world authority on Buddhist architecture and symbolism. He says the most sacred Buddhist symbols were gifted to humanity by a non-human source. The Dogons say not only was it non-human, it was also originally non-material. So as a researcher, I'm left in a hard position because I can take the stance that the Buddhists and the Dogon each managed to keep all those intimate details of their tradition straight for thousands of years, and then, arriving in the modern day, they somehow both misremembered in matching ways who they got it from. Or else, I can take the position that they remembered that last detail correctly also, and now I have to allow that there could have been a non-human source.
Okay. And specifically, what is the non-human source that they cite?
Well, to understand this, in the viewpoint of Samkhya, which is the philosophy that underlies all this stuff, universes form in pairs, one non-material and one material. The non-material is characterized as having perfect knowledge, but an inability to act. And the material side is said to have imperfect knowledge and full ability to act. And so the non-material side is understood to routinely make attempts to communicate knowledge or induce actions on the material side. And they do it through vivid dreams, through divination, through synchronicities, through the odd behavior of animals, things like that, through things paranormal, that we would call paranormal. Okay, the modern scientific view is that matter in its wave-like form, which we can see as being virtually massless, transforms itself instantly into particles, which is matter. So the traditional scientific view is that material forms arise from non-material ones. So the idea that something that was originally non-material might express itself materially isn't a radical view. It's a traditional view. Okay. So the way these energies work, like these universes work, is there is a cycle of scrolling energy from the non-material side to the material side that the Dogon compare to the natural water cycle. You know, the cycle of water evaporating to create clouds that rise up over the mountains and then fall as rain into the rivers that flow back to the oceans. Without that cycle of water, there wouldn't be life on the planet.
Right.
The Dogon are saying without this cycle of energy between universes, there wouldn't be life in the universe. Now, turns out it's not just energy that's scrolling, it's also mass. And Einstein says when a thing becomes more massive, its time frame slows down. So a virtually massless universe, a non-material universe, has to persist in a time frame that's really ultra quick compared to ours. Now, if you imagine that scrolling energy as an hourglass, there's a point in the middle of the process where you have the same amount of sand in the top as you have in the bottom. At that point, time frames equalize. And when the time frames equalize, it's like you've got an airlock. It's theoretically possible that the things in outer, by metaphor, the thing that's sitting in outer space with no pressure can make its way into the space capsule where it's pressure, because the time frame pressure has equalized. So in those middle eras of the cycle, which happens to be the era of Gobekli Tepe, the era of Orkney Island, about 3200 BC, actually it's about 3600 BC and after, it's theoretically possible for an intelligence on the non-material side to move to the material side. If you read stories in the book of, stories in the Old Testament about Moses on the mountain with God and all the cautions to the Israelites to keep back from the mountain because of the bad effects that might accrue to them if they approach too closely, you have an example of a non-material something presenting itself materially. In terms of this energy cycle, the scrolling energy cycle, if you think of that in the context of a year, if the energy scrolls one way and then it scrolls back the other way, if you think of that as a great year, the points where the energy is equalizing are the equinoxes. Mm-hmm. The Egyptian word for equinox was keper, which is non-material coming into material. In Judaism, at one equinox you have Yom Kippur, mm-hmm. a holiday. At the other equinox, you have a holiday called Passover. And a Passover Seder ends with the opening of a door to allow a symbolic non-material entity to enter. So there, Judaism is actually acting out the thing I'm saying it's happened.
Okay. And it's also that this universe is malformed, right? Like, or there's an error.
Right. And that, okay, again, that they're trying to convey a concept, and there are different ways of expressing that. The true perspective is not that there's an error, but there's a difference. It's expressed in Dogon culture as an error. In Kabbalism, it's expressed as a different way. What the Dogon are actually describing is a difference in the way that non-material and material structures form. On the non-material side, okay, these compare to sushi. There are two types of sushi. There's one where the seaweed wraps around the rice, and there's a second kind of sushi where the rice wraps around the seaweed. Mm-hmm. That's the essential difference between spirals of energy on the non-material side and the material side. The material one relates to the seaweed on the outside. The non-material relates to the seaweed on the inside.
Okay.
Now, that process of the energy involves these two spirals that scroll in opposite directions. It actually creates the dynamic of a scroll. In Kabbalism, it's called the energy is called the primordial scroll. It's compared a Torah scroll sitting in a Jewish temple is symbolic of the energy of these universes. Okay. And in a Jewish temple, every Jewish temple on the same day is reading the same portion of that scroll.
Right.
And it's timed so that over the course of the year, they read every portion of that scroll. They finish up the scroll by the end of the year, then they rewind it. Well, that's what happens with the energy dynamically, is that it scrolls from one universe to the other, and then when it reaches the extent of how far it can scroll, it then reverses itself and it scrolls back. This is the dynamic of what's called a dipole. It's an energetic dynamic, a scientific dynamic. It's how magnetism works. It's how electricity works. It's how gravity potentially works. So the reversal in energy that we're just now seeing, supposedly via the Yuga cycle, is that reversing point of the scroll.
Okay. What are the connections now you talk about Skara Brae in 2 books ago now?
Right.
And you talk about that being another civilizing center that was established later after Gobekli Tepe and stuff. What are the connections you find between that and the Maori culture?
The term Aru is one that is originally, for me, associated with Orkney Island. Ancient terms for Orkney, one was Argot. A number of different terms are based on R, which is a concept of ascension. Now, ascension, when we're talking about matter, refers to progressive stages of matter, how it forms. What we have on Orkney is the beginnings of the megalithic tradition in the UK. What nobody noticed was that the series of structures that play out in spiral shape on Orkney Island are the effective alphabet of those stages of creation, carved in stone there since 3200 BC. And they lead to this first farming village called Skara, which consists of 8 chambers, which is itself another stage in the processes of creation. So the name, an ancient term I associate with Orkney is Aru. There is also originally a sanctuary or a church on Orkney at a place that's now called Kirkwall, but originally was called Kirkwa. The Maori preserve a tradition of a mythical school far to the east from them that they called Arukira. They patterned their village schools after the school on Arukira, and they're teaching all the same. They're teaching all the same subject matter in their schools that I see evidence was being taught, and the Dogon say was being taught in their mythical schools, which I also pinpoint on Orkney. So we have fundamental connection here with the concepts of these schools. That's one link. We have all sorts of connections linguistically. We have all sorts of connections symbolically. The Maori don't create megalithic stone structures the way that some other cultures do. The Maori were known to mark certain meeting places with stones, small standing stones, but it's not at all on the scale of what we see at Stonehenge or on Orkney Island.
Okay, and there's also connections though to, and I forget how to say it exactly, but Tuatha Duan.
Yes, that the earliest Scandinavian sagas report finding. Okay, let me rewind just a little bit. The Dogon say that in their mythical place of instruction, the one that I associate with Orkney, that their mythical teachers called the Numo were providing 8 members of a culture at a time with instruction in agriculture and cosmology. The reason they took 8 at a time is because they were also concerned about harmful effects on us from being around them. So their solution to that danger was to limit it. They selected 8 members of a tribe, brought them to Orkney, taught them, or brought them to wherever the Dogon say to their mythical place of instruction that was remote from where the Dogon lived, taught them cosmology and agriculture, and sent them back to teach everybody else. That's a dynamic we recognize mythically all over the world. We have it in China, have it in South America, we have it in Egypt, we have it all over the place. The 8 mythical ancestors or teachers or deities or emperors or whatever they happen to be who brought civilizing skills with them. So that pattern on Orkney, in the mythical, the earliest sagas on Orkney, what they reported finding on Orkney were 2 groups side by side. The first were a group of Pygmies of very strange habits, and the second group were a set of average-sized people who were so different from the Scandinavians as to constitute a different race. I'm saying that what they stumbled on Orkney were the Dogon's teachers, the Numo, and the Dogon clerics themselves. These average-sized people always wore white like the Dogon priests do. Now, as it turns out, an ancient Egyptian word for pygmy was nema. The Egyptian vowel sounds are not certain. They didn't write the vowel sounds, so somebody had to guess what the vowel sounds were. So nema is effectively Nuo.
Okay.
Now the Pygmies were referred to as the Peti, originally on Orkney. It's understood that the Peti are related to the Picts who survived in the UK, and the Picts connected the Tuatha Danann. In the Shakti cult, the mother goddess who is central to all this stuff is called um, Tana Penu. Tana is a phonetic shift a little bit from culture to culture. Tana connects to Dana in Greece, to Tuatha De Danann. Dana is the same Dana. This carries forward into the Maori culture as Tain, who, with symbolic reversals, is now a god. What's interesting in the Maori culture is, in their myths, you have preserved in some of these myths the remnants of it having been a matriarchal tradition. There's one god they describe who in a second myth says was given as a wife to another god. But the traditional outlook in the Maori is that this god is male, not female. So you have little self-contradictions like that point to the idea that this thing they're representing as being masculine in the Maori culture was originally feminine.
Okay. So, and
So
why that switch between male and female?
that's one of the symbolic reversals that happens halfway through the cycle. Now, with the energy that scrolls from the non-material to the material universe, let's say less material and more material universe, the cycle is a dipole. We're shifting energy together and then we're shifting it apart. The side that 10,000 years ago was the less material side, today is the fully material side. Halfway through the cycle, it shifts. It changes over from being the less material side to being the more material side. And if you're using symbols to represent those things, you have to change which symbol you use to represent it. Originally, a circle represented the Earth when it was the less material side. Now a square represents the Earth because we're the more material side.
Okay, that makes some sense.
And so that explains virtually all of the symbolic reversals are connected to this shifting energy, which side is less material, which side is more material.
What about, let's talk about the overturning of Mother Earth, because this is always a subject that I find really fascinating.
One of the metaphors for that, one of the ways they convey the idea of the Earth turning over, is with the image of a capsizing boat, or an overturned or an overthrown boat is how it's referred to. My original title for my book, The Mystery of Skara Brae, my working title was The Overthrown Boat, because the Egyptian words that are correlates to the name Skara Brae mean literally overthrown boat, overturned boat. The concept that's being communicated is that some energetic dynamic periodically causes the poles of the Earth to shift. More than that, the swapping of the poles is representative of the dynamic of a dipole. It's the fundamental dynamic of energy everywhere. In Egyptian culture, there are texts that flatly say that 3 times in Egyptian memory, the sun rose where it formerly set. We have cultures all over the planet that also claim that there was a shift in where the sun was. In China, it disappeared for a long period of time. The sun did. They couldn't see it. And all of the wise men came together to try to predict where it was going to rise when they finally saw it again. Nobody guessed east. There are Indian and Native American Indian traditions of watching the stars fall. We have woolly mammoths in Siberia that were flash frozen quick enough that the contents of their last meal is still in their stomachs undigested.
Yeah.
This is, in a matter of hours, what had been in a subtropical zone was suddenly now in an Arctic zone.
And you actually you have, I think the first time I had you on, we talked about the book you wrote on Velikovsky.
Right.
Which may be one of the things that caused that whole pole
That's
shift.
right. I mean, there are a number of things that could cause it. An impact from a comet. There are researchers like Randall Carlson who have spent a lot of time gathering evidence about impacts from comets on the planet about the time of the end of the Ice Age.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of an impact of a large enough body hitting the planet in the right spot can cause a change in the tilt of the axis. If you change the tilt of the axis, suddenly all the ice caps melt in a short amount of time and they reform again in another place. In Antarctica, we have petrified primordial growth forests of the sort that Lewis and Clark found on the West Coast when they arrived at the United States. Given the amount of sunlight we presently have at the South Pole, you shouldn't be able to grow a tree like that.
Right. Yeah.
So the implication of their very existence is that they weren't always there. They weren't always situated that way. Now, electromagnetically, the idea of tipping the planet over is a fairly easy thing. As long as you're not changing the rotational axis of the planet, how you tilt that axis, I'm sure it wouldn't be a fun effect to have to live through, but it's certainly a survivable effect to live through.
And that comet could have been Venus as well.
That comet could have been connected to Venus as well. That's true. It could have. Getting back to Velikovsky, there were he's postulating close approaches of Venus and Mars to the Earth, at Venus at 1500 BC and Mars at around 709 BC. The 709 BC boundary is a really interesting one because you have all sorts of effects. You have major fluctuation in the magnetic pole that can't explain. You have a major volcanic activity they can't explain. You have major climate change just after that time you can't explain. You have cultures all over the planet suddenly abandoning their 360-day year and changing to a 365-day year at the same moment for no good reason.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one good reason would be if the length of the year had actually changed.
Right.
You have a change in the absorption rate of ions for plants at 709 BC that wreaks havoc with radiometric dating. We have a circumstance with eclipses that, okay, if you think of eclipses as being caused by the regular clockwork motion of the Earth and the Moon and the Sun, then theoretically we could use a computer program and walk the numbers back from today. And if our calculations are right, we should be able to verify every place and date of an eclipse that happened going back as far as we want to go.
Mm-hmm.
We can do that as far as 709 BC. Every total eclipse of the sun that happened since 709 BC, we can hit right on the money. Not a single total eclipse of the sun reported in any culture prior to 709 BC can be calculated that way without fudging it.
Huh.
And so any of these star programs that you hear about that ostensibly display to you what the sky looked like in, 1200 BC,
Mm-hmm.
unless the retailers or the developers of that software can represent that their calculations can hit those total eclipses, they don't have no firm idea where the stars were before 709 BC. It's only the eclipses that anchor our perspective on where those stars were. And so theoretically, before 709 BC, any star could be in any relationship to us.
And what does that do to things like the Orion correlation?
What it means is that we can't count on the dating as being absolute. Because we have 2 points to compare to at Giza. We have the Sphinx pointing to the constellation of Leo and the pyramids pointing to the belt stars at the same moment. We can make that line. And we believe that alignment comes around 1500 BC or around 10,000 BC. But if we don't really know for sure where the stars were, then we can't count on that timing as being absolute.
Okay. That's interesting because that kind of throws a monkey wrench into everything.
It does. Anything before 709 BC, all of that timing can be off. Velikovsky wrote a second book called Aegis and Chaos, where he points out that historians from various cultures, there's a 700-year span of events that get repeated as if they were separate events, but they're really matching events that throw the traditional historical timeline of that the chronologies are based on off by 700 years.
Oh,
And
that's interesting.
his book is focused on demonstrating again and again and again and again his same sequence of events moving forward, same progression over the course of 700 years from this point to that point, expressed in terms of different names in a different culture or whatever, but distanced from each other in such a way that the historians didn't notice that they had a repeating segment here.
And how does that go unnoticed?
Well, because they don't have every discipline ends up having blinders on to a certain extent. They get down into their own little tunnel and they come into it with their own set of instructed preconceptions about how things have to be looked at, and they don't question their own assumptions. It takes someone coming from a different field of study who has a slightly different perspective on these things to say, and who doesn't have those same preconceptions, to say, no, you need to look at it this way, not that way.
Okay. Let's see, what else do we have here in a couple minutes we have left. Let's talk about the field of Aru and how that matches with New Zealand and all these other places.
Well, imagine that you walked onto Orkney Island and what you saw carved in stone were the letters A, B, C, D, F. If that's what you saw, anybody who knew English would recognize an alphabetic sequence.
Mm-hmm.
What I saw walking onto Orkney Island was a cosmological sequence, an alphabet of cosmological stages. That's the equivalent of A, B, C, D, F. Now, it takes you as far as Skara Brae, which is represents, depending on how you look at it, the 7th or the 8th stage in that process. But the Dogon describe upward stages that go beyond that. So one of the questions I asked for myself was, could there have been an attempt to represent the next stage beyond that? Well, in Dogon culture, the next stage is the stage in which primordial fundamental particles form against what's called the background fields. This is the way scientists describe it. Hawking says there are more than 200 fundamental particles. These represent essentially different vibrations of strings in string theory. The Dogon say there are 266 of them. They're precise. Now, the way the Dogon try to represent these vibrations is, at the time of the harvest, or the planting, they go to the field of their highest priest, who's called the Aru priest, and they create what's essentially a crop circle in his field. They draw a circle, and inside that circle, they draw zigzag lines that are supposed to represent vibrations of matter. And over a series of 50 years, they draw all 266 vibrations of matter in that field. So this is the field of the Aru priest. Now, my perspective in researching Orkney initially was that I was seeing Egyptian influences on Orkney. As it turns out, I believe the influences go the other way. The timing is such that it's Orkney influences on dynastic Egypt. But so I wondered, since in that era it wouldn't have been Dogon references, it would have been Egyptian references, could there be any equivalent concept to this field of the Aru priest in Egypt? Well, the Egyptian word for field is seket. And there is a concept, Seket Eru, in Egypt, but it refers to the mythical field of reeds. The field of reeds is a place, it's essentially the Egyptian underworld, where the soul of a deceased pharaoh would go after death. He's depicted as working in agricultural fields. The images could very easily be Orkney. The animals that are depicted are animals that are indigenous to Orkney. The plants are indigenous to Orkney. The descriptions they give are commensurate with Orkney. You go beyond Egypt, and the same concept was preserved as the Elysian fields in ancient Greece. And okay, now on the Dogon level, we have an actual physical geographical field that is also representing a cosmological concept. So this is being worked on two levels for the Dogon. It's the field of the arrow priest, but it's also representative of fundamental particles against a background field. In Egypt, we have the same thing. It looks like we have the same thing. We have this mythical concept of a place where souls go, but it looks as if on Orkney we have an actual physical representation of that same concept. That there are numerous reasons to connect Orkney to that concept. You go to ancient Greece with the Elysian fields, they also represented on two levels. It's treated as a mythological concept, but it's also treated as a real geographical place. And the Greeks provide us with descriptions, physical descriptions of it. They say it's located on the eastern side of the Western Ocean, which is right where Orkney is. They describe it as an island, a white island. Orkney is characterized by stunning white beaches. The Greeks describe it as a place of great winds. Orkney's weather is typified by great winds, so great that the locals learn to park their car facing the wind in a certain direction so they don't have problems opening and closing their doors. The Greeks even go so far as to refer to the place as Okeanos. Pindar refers to it as Okeanos. So we even got a phonetic name that aligns with Orkney. So there's lots of reason to think that this rendition of the Egyptian underworld existed on Orkney until around 2600 BC. And then some interesting things happen after 2600 BC. A pharaoh comes to power in Egypt called Sene Pharaoh. Sene is a word that means image or reflection of, and pharaoh is pharaoh like the Faroe Islands that are to the north and west of Orkney. Sene Pharaoh is the guy who starts building pyramids, and he's not building your typical geometric pyramids. He's building the bent pyramid that changes angles inexplicably halfway up, and a couple of other forms that don't look like regular pyramids. The Egyptologists have rationales for why they ended up looking the way they looked. Mm-hmm. But if you compare to dramatic peaks that exist in the Faroe Islands, you have counterparts to each one of these four pyramids. You get them side by side and they look just alike. Huh. It looks as if the pharaoh who picked his own name was nostalgic for the Faroe Islands and Orkney, where presumably he was instructed in the skills that are required to be a pharaoh in Egypt, and started build. This was 2600 BC, is the same era when Orkney was abruptly abandoned, and so it's an appropriate era for an Egyptian pharaoh to say, "I want to memorialize it." Okay. Those structures end up. It's that same era where people leave Orkney, travel down into the UK, and then I say on to New Zealand.
All right. Well, we're just about out of time. But again, the book is Decoding Maori Cosmology, the Ancient Origins of New Zealand's Indigenous Culture. It's available, I'm assuming, everywhere.
Yes, it is available. This is through Inner Traditions, which is a subsidiary of Simon & Schuster. So I have author pages both of those places. The book is available on Amazon everywhere. It's in bookstores. Usually my new books are on the shelf at Barnes & Noble. I haven't actually checked to see if this one is, but I'm presuming that it is. It can be ordered through any bookstore.
And it is excellent, as all of your books have been.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for spending time with us, Laird.
Well, thank you very much, Seriah. I really appreciate you having me on again.
And a special thanks to all of my Patreons, and particularly those pledging $10 or more for the extra support: Super Inframan, Andy McNamara, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, Allison Cook, Craig Cisneros, Donna Beveridge, Sasha Lorg, Christopher Vaughn, Robert Groom, Scott Morris Everett, Chris Elmquist, Russell Wilcoxon, Patricia Giaquinta, Matthias Sumby, and John Eddy. Thank you all so much. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.